Well, good morning and welcome to the start of the second day of this year's Bled Strategic Forum, and welcome to our quite an early discussion. And I hope this also means that in the course of discussion this room will get fuller, but our early discussion on the future of Europe. There's no Bled Strategic Forum without this discussion. There is a good reason why this year is exactly the same, and why we're starting off with a panel called On How Many Futures for the EU. I believe that yesterday's panels have set the scene for today's discussion, and as you can hear, my voice is not the best, so I'll use yesterday's almost 6 hours of talks for the scene setter. I won't dwell on it. I will just point to 3 elements said yesterday. And then the organizers have been very kind to spare me further from my voice. And we will have a short 3-minute video as a scene setter then for a discussion. And after that video, I will invite my distinguished panel to the podium, and we will then start. So yesterday's panels, I think, have shown, I imagine you agree with me, at least to an extent, quite a bleak analysis of the future of Europe. What stayed with me was the era of abundance is over. If you Google it now, it's full of, in any possible language, already the discussions on what President Macron meant with that and what does it mean, the sacrifices we will have to take, and whether it's limited to France only. The second one was Foreign Minister Schallenberg. We've been thrown out of paradise, from paraphrasing Robert Kagan. And the third one, the Slovenian Prime Minister saying, we need a new way. We have to do it differently. No country has patience to wait for 10 years. Now, this brings our discussion of the futures of the EU together with discussions of the futures of Europe, and I will use these terms interchangeably because I think no future of the EU can be discussed without the future of Europe. And as we will be discussing today, this analysis, but complementing it with the assessment of the options for the future, giving advice for the course of action to the policymakers, we'll be focusing ourselves on 3 elements, which are pretty encompassing pretty much everything there is to discuss. The first one is the strength of our democracy at every level, local, regional, member state, and European. We'll be looking into how to pursue Europe's interests globally and defend and promote our values. So how to strengthen our voice and capacity for action in that, for those objectives. And thirdly, how to ensure security and prosperity for our citizens. So democracy, global Europe, and security and prosperity for our citizens. I will stop here, and I invite you to this 3-minute video, and then we'll start the panel.
It started with a story. Europa, the stunning Phoenician princess, and Zeus, the mighty king of the gods. Enamored of Europa, Zeus abducted the young princess and carried her across the sea. Europa's new home would see its share of history in the centuries to follow. And the future? In a world of numerous unknowns, there is a multitude of possible developments. We know now that the history did not end, and nothing is impossible. Let's imagine a few scenarios. Europe in 2050. The political divisions and disagreement about core European values and a common future have reached the point of no return. Years of disinformation and rising nationalism have dealt democracy a devastating blow. The rise of populist regimes and the economic downturn led to some European countries adopting policies that unsettle the markets. This breaks apart the Eurozone and, shortly, the European Union itself. New conflicts erupt, and the cradle of Western civilization, drifts into disarray and irrelevance. In another scenario, economic interests prevail. In this future, the reluctance to abandon the economic benefits of EU membership suppresses the divisions. The pandemic leaves the Union institutionally stronger in fiscal and health policies, yet cooperation on security and defense remains weak. Innovation intensifies, but it's still lagging behind global leaders. The inability to adapt is gradually eroding the EU's voice in global affairs. In yet another alternate future, Europe reaches the ultimate stage of an ever closer union. Several member states take advantage of the enhanced cooperation, and a union within the union gradually emerges. New enlargement completes the consolidation of the continent, and soon more members join the core group. A much more robust and advanced form of integration, Europe becomes the global leader in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and robotics. Its sheer economic power renders Europe the main creator of international standards in the environment, privacy, and consumer rights, among others. In addition to its formidable soft power, Europe now also has a sizable military force. We can anticipate alternative realities, but we cannot predict. There are many things that we can act upon, and even more that are beyond our control. Anticipating and preparing to withstand in the yet unknown is what makes us resilient. Accepting the uncertainty, embracing the future.
Please join me in congratulating the Artistic Director of the Bled Strategic Forum, Žiga Pirnat, for, thank you, Žiga, providing us with these 3 thought-provoking options. May I invite the panel to join me on the podium? And while you are all getting settled, allow me to include the audience. It is an early hour, so let me wake you up. After having seen these thought-provoking 3 options, allow me to ask you to vote on the 3 of them now, and then let's see what 75 minutes of debate, 57 minutes of debate, if they might change your mind. Now, I think the major contours of the 3 options have been presented well, so I'll ask you to raise your hands for the respectively Ares, Hermes, and Athena option, as you personally believe is possible from what you know now about the capacity of EU, European institutions and politicians to choose the course of action, and of course also of the citizens' wishes and, well, let's say, yeah, wishes, let's stay with that. So, who votes for the Ares option? The 2050 was there as a benchmark. 1, and my quick judgment suggests this is the youngest person in the room. Now I'm worried. Who votes for the Hermes option? That's a bit more cross-generational, if I may say. This is not quite Eurovision. I think I counted 12. And Athena? Thank you very much. Let's see if we can make this happen. So I invited the panel to provide assessment and advice for the action based on the analysis that we have, and also add to the analysis, of course. We have 6 panelists, 54 minutes to go, I think. I will ask an initial question to all of them. And then we will elaborate on their answers in a conversation between the panelists. Then I will pass the floor on to Mr. Peterle, who's our first listener and who will ask thought-provoking questions both to you but also to the panelists. And then I will involve you, and I believe there will be microphone coming around. And I hope to have 2 or 3 rounds of questions to the panelists. Now, let me also take my seat. So we have I have to say for Bled, a very decent panel of 6, so thank you very much to the organizers. And the panel is also, I would say, special in the sense that it combines politicians, acting politicians, former politicians, academics, think tankers, and I believe this is already a good sign for the discussions to come. We will start with Minister Byrne, Irish Minister for European Affairs. Welcome. I'll present the whole panel very quickly before we start. We will continue with State Secretary Stutzin, State Secretary for European Affairs. Then Maria João Rodrigues, welcome to the panel. I think very well known also to the Bled Strategic Forum, former member of the European Parliament. Then Guillaume Closa, I believe you've seen him in action last night. Guillaume is, of course, the founder of Europa Nova, but also senior VP at Hill and Knowlton, and a writer who's, I believe, one of the books at least inspired the title of this panel. We will continue then with Charles Powell from Real Instituto Elcano and finish off with Charles Grant, both director of the Centre for European Reform London. Minister Byrne, the title is How Many Futures for Europe or for the EU? You will have noticed, as I said, I will be using these interchangeably. Do you use this interchangeably? What's your perspective of the many futures for the EU or Europe? And of course, the relationship between the European Union and Europe in that respect.
Well, I have to be honest, I think there's one future for the EU, and that is the EU itself. The EU is not perfect, but it is the greatest peace process in the history of the world. The EU is the greatest collaboration, the greatest integration of countries in the history of the world, in my opinion. It's one of the greatest innovations in our democracy. It's certainly not perfect. When we look to the future here and we talk about the EU being the standard setter for privacy, for climate, for consumer rights, I mean, it already is the standard setter for all of those, in my opinion. Again, not perfect. Maybe the standards aren't exactly what we all want, but not perfect. We don't have vetoes. In day-to-day life, in those areas at least. And I think I'm very hopeful about the future, but I think that the future has to be the European Union, not variations of it, not certainly not the destruction of the European Union. And within that, yes, we will make changes from time to time to have things move better. But overall, it's still going to be the European Union, as we know it, the sharing of sovereignty, the democratic principles, the values of human rights and the rule of law that underpin everything. And I think it's certainly going to be there and certainly going to continue doing its work. And really, some of the changes that we talk about on a day-to-day basis, I believe in the overall scheme of things, you know, aren't huge. I mean, the big decision was to come together to pool sovereignty. Other further decisions, a single market, for example, common foreign and security policy, some of the changes in the Lisbon Treaty. I really believe that some of the other stuff is really around the edges. And yes, we are at a pivotal moment in history, there's no doubt, with war on the European continent. But even then, I think, despite our flaws, despite our imperfections, we've shown ourselves as a European Union that is relatively agile and relatively able to react, notwithstanding that we're not a defence alliance. So I'm very hopeful about the future, and I'm very hopeful about the present as well.
Thank you very much. So one future, and that future is the EU. State Secretary Stutzin, I imagine you agree?
Well, I definitely agree. And first of all, I have to say that there is one future. But the problem is we don't know what this future is. And we, as the representatives of the governments or European institutions or citizens, we have to make sure that this future that we will be living in the next 10, 20, 30 years will simply be the best one. We want we know what we want from our future, and from Slovenian side I can say that we definitely would like to see European Union, that it's safe, that's secure, that's resilient, and that protects our common values on which the European Union was built. I would maybe like to mention also the geographical aspects of the discussion, and maybe go back to what President Pahor said yesterday at the opening of the Bled Strategic Forum. We are all aware of the situation we are in. We are all aware of the geopolitical turbulence or crisis, or however you put it. The thing is that in Europe, we fear that there may be a new bloc division coming a reality. And in this situation, European Union needs to make sure that we will stick together and clearly define what and who we are. And here I would really like to, we're repeating this over and over again, say that we should not forget about the Western Balkans countries. It's the region in the middle of the European Union. We can say it's almost terra incognita for the most of Europe, unfortunately. But it's the region that we used to think the Western Balkan countries needs Europe, needs European Union, but we need them. We need them, especially now. And we should not forget about this, and whatever future we live in the next 10, 20, 30 years, it should include Western Balkans.
Thank you very much. A very clear statement here. Maria João Rodrigues.
Well, I would say that the European project has been shaped by two major processes. One is enlargement, and another one is deepening. And we should ask, what should you do now? And in fact, there are different futures. That's why the panel today is so relevant. And there are different choices. My point would be, say, we need to go for enlargement, starting with the Balkans, and then we have also the offer of candidacy to Ukraine and Moldova. This is a moral and political imperative. But I would say that also need deepening. So my point is that we need not to choose between either enlargement or deepening. We need both with different new approaches. This is my point. On enlargement, a new approach, because in fact we need to have a political approach and geopolitical approach, and when it takes the economic dimension of enlargement, we also need to involve these countries in our European networks, in better European coordination. When it comes deepening, in the past, others will call for a special organized club, directoire. I don't think we need this. We just need to have the instruments with the capacity to decide and to act inside the European Union. And we need to have stronger instruments, because we need to have stronger strategic autonomy. We need to move to a new development model. We need to have the budgetary capacity to support this. And this only happens if we have a major, stronger democratic drive in the European Union. So these are my ideas to start with.
Thank you very much. Now we do have a differentiation here. I believe many of you have been studying these affairs and recognize the widening versus deepening dilemma. And with this, Maria João Rodrigues also introduced the current debates that have been launched by President Macron, Charles Michel on the European political community, European geopolitical community, but also ideas on further federation by Enrique Letta and others. Now we continue with Guillaume Closa. I believe it's been a decade or over a decade ago you wrote the book titled Europe, la dernière chance. Sounds quite bleak, but it's been a decade, and now we're discussing about the futures of Europe. And if you have read the concept note for the panel, it said also that the EU is not a cat, it only has one life. So how many futures for Europe, and whether this was the la dernière chance already a decade ago, if this was, where are we now?
So first of all, I agree with Maria Jo Rodriguez, so I will not elaborate on this. 10 years ago, indeed, I published this book, and this book was based upon the work I made for the European Council on the future of Europe. And at the time, we have identified for 2020 7 drivers. Democracy needs to be revived, and we need to invent the next transnational European democratic step. First, sustainability is not an option. Third, energy will need a real European policy. Fourth, tech will drive growth and need to be put at the service of human. 5, we need a European defense because we don't know how long we can be supported by the US. War is anew possible in Europe. 6, geopolitics, we are in a rebalancing of power, and we need to listen and to discuss with the world. And 7, health will be key for Europeans. So that were 7 drivers. 12 years ago, they are now at the heart of European politics. So the question for me is, for European citizens, Europe has gone, has went on, and finally, if we look back, there was a big risk of fragmentation. We work on that with Maria. And we have avoided fragmentation. And somehow the Brexit helped us to be more united. This is a paradox, and helped us also to build together. Without the UK, with the UK, it would have been much more difficult. And my feeling is we would not have been in a position to cope with the COVID or to act as we are acting now with regard to the war. So it's a very important point. The question for me is, for European citizens, Europe is something which is only responsive. And at a certain moment, when you are only responsive and reactive, you are tiring. For me, politics is very Machiavellian. I like this word of Machiavel, who was saying, take the lead in order to implement the new order of things. And I think we are exactly in this period where Europe needs to take the lead in order to implement this new order of things if it wants to be inclusive, both for member states and for citizens. And the second thing, very quickly, I just wrote a book on European civilization, and we have a 2-hour discussion yesterday evening with Zizek on this issue. And the topic is, as President Zelensky said, Europe is embodying a new, the EU is embodying a new civilization, which is not a war civilization, but a peaceful civilization. And the question is, Europe is a kind of political embodiment of this civilization, the EU, and we need to build a new narrative around that, because we are in a war of narrative and civilization, and Europe needs to have one if it wants to survive.
Right. I think we'll elaborate on that narrative in subsequent discussions, but let me move on now to Charles Powell. One Europe, several Europes, one future, several futures?
I'm very sanguine about the future of the European Union. To use Chris Patton's famous expression, I'm a federast. And I'm really quite optimistic about the future of the EU. Having said that, and listening very closely, very attentively to yesterday's debates, which I think were very interesting, my main fear at the moment is that perhaps the European Union is becoming incompatible with a more unified Europe as a whole. What do I mean by this? Obviously, the EU will always be the core element of the future of the European continent. But there is a very real danger that we are leaving behind many non-EU member states. The Western Balkans, of course, but also Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. And I'm glad you mentioned Enrico Letta's idea of a European confederation. Of course, the word confederation is controversial for obvious reasons. But, listening to the Spanish foreign minister, he said that the main priority of the Spanish presidency of the EU will be European unity. And that's fine and dandy. But the problem is, how do we bridge the gap between the EU and non-EU member states? Now, this is a strategic forum, so let's do a little thinking out of the box. I don't know whether we need a treaty to bring together the EU 27 plus the 9, in other words, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and the Western Balkans, or whether looser arrangements will suffice. But the main point that I would like to stress is that there is a real danger that we are leaving these countries behind. I think both Macron and Letta were effectively acknowledging that these countries are not converging with the EU at an adequate rate. So, as Maria João Rodrigues was saying, we have to go back to this old debate about deepening versus enlargement. I have always believed that historically they have been compatible. In fact, we have often deepened as a result of enlargement, or to prepare for enlargement, to be more precise. And I think that can continue to be the case. So my main concern right now is, what kind of constellation, what kind of policies can we actually generate from the hard core, from the EU, to assist non-EU members to converge with a view to eventually becoming members of the European family. And I think that since we're talking about this here in Bled, Slovenia, this is really the most important conversation that we can have right now.
Thank you very much. And we conclude with Charles Grant. I have seen your piece advocating or urging the British government to pay attention to what's happening on the continent, in particular to the closer political cooperation on the continent. So now we've had the concept introduced, European political cooperation versus confederation, perhaps. What's your views? What are your views on that?
Well, I think we do need more than one Europe. The most important Europe, as Thomas Byrne said, is, of course, the European Union, and that will be the core of whatever happens in the rest of Europe, I'm sure, in terms of economics and perhaps in the future in security too. But it's not enough on its own. The European Union is trying quite hard to do more in defence, and I applaud its efforts. There's an important European Defence Fund. There's a plan for a 5,000-strong rapid reaction force. But if you want to stand up to Russia and China and have as much geopolitical weight as possible, you need a broader, wider organisation. I think Macron understands that. He's proposed a few years ago this thing called the European Intervention Initiative, which is not a very important organisation at the moment, has the potential to become important. It's an idea of getting about a dozen members, more sort of serious military powers, to adopt a common military culture and work together in the defence sphere. But I do think his idea of the European political community is important. I mean, it's got a number of different rationales. One is that the neighbourhood policy isn't working very well. Another is you've got to find a forum to include Turkey somehow. Another is you've got to do more for the Western Balkans until enlargement can reach the Western Balkans. Another is to socialise the British, so the British don't cut off their links to Europe entirely. And I do think the idea of a club where the European countries can sit together and talk about big strategic challenges, whether it's how to deal with Russia or energy issues or infrastructure or climate issues, is very important. And for this, in terms of Europe as a geopolitical actor, you do have to find ways of including the British. It's rather difficult because they don't want to be included at the moment. I actually asked Liz Truss about 6 weeks ago at a conference, what's your view on the European political community? She's not in favour, I'm afraid. But the EU countries are going to have to be patient. In the long run, there will be a British government that wants to have closer links with the EU. And I'll finish with this. I mean, I think that Keir Starmer is quite likely to be the next British Prime Minister, in my view. I may be wrong on that, but we'll see. He's the Labour leader. He's not going to want to rejoin the EU, or he won't even want to rejoin the single market or the customs union or restore freedom of movement. But he will want a better relationship. He will want to have a much closer, more constructive relationship to revisit many of the problems. I think, as Thomas Byrne knows all about the Northern Ireland Protocol, he would certainly want to compromise on the protocol and be more flexible on that. He would want to, I believe, join the European political community. He'd want to have structured links on foreign and defence policy. He would want to do a deal on plant and animal health to reduce a lot of the friction at the border. So I think in all sorts of ways we can expect a more constructive relationship between the UK and the EU in the long run. But the EU is going to have to be patient because Mrs. Truss, who's almost certainly going to be the next Prime Minister, isn't going to help in that respect.
Thank you very much. This concludes our first round. I'm looking at the clock. I think we can do another round among the panelists. So let me just build on your initial remarks. Minister Byrne, you sound very optimistic. I won't say tragically optimistic in reference to yesterday Edi's Rama's remarks, if you might recall them. If I can ask you for a few ideas or singling out a few edges that need to be brushed for the EU to be able to widen. You're very optimistic, small reforms are necessary, but if we are to enlarge, and we will enlarge, or EU is to enlarge, how could it accept or assimilate, no, that's not a good word, how could it accept further members?
Well, just on the whole point of enlargement, the whole point of enlargement and deepening, which has been mentioned, and obviously they do go hand in hand, I think we have to be very careful that we're bringing everybody along with us as well. So while the Irish public, for example, would be very in favour of enlargement, enthusiastically in favour of enlargement of the EU, the Irish public may not be as enthusiastic on deepening of powers, particularly in some areas such as defence and tax, for example. And yet the opposite is probably the case in some other member states where maybe the public aren't quite as in favour of enlargement but would be in favour of deepening. So I think what we have to do is that we have to be very, very careful that we're bringing the public with us, the citizens for whom this EU project exists. And I think that's why all of these issues are very, very important. But when we discuss them, we've got to make sure we're bringing the public with us, because I think if the public feel that the politicians are racing ahead of them, they may react in an unfavourable or a negative way. And in many countries, if we're to proceed with these futures that we're talking about, we may have to have referendums, not for enlargement in Ireland, but possibly for enlargement in some countries, but certainly for deepening in Ireland and some other member states. So I think we have to make sure that citizens are very much part of that conversation. Yes, the citizens clearly understand the challenges, but I think we've a constant challenge ourselves to explain to the citizens what we have and what we want. I think we have to be constantly optimistic about the future, because there are so many others who simply reminisce about the past and talk about the good old days or look back to ancient times. I think we have to have the past as a guide, but very much as a guide to our future rather than dwelling in the past. I think that danger is there. We see with populists right across this continent who are glorifying the past, and we have to be very, very careful, I think, to promise and work for a realistic, better future for all of our people.
Let me link the taking the citizens with us with what State Secretary Stutzin said, that we know what we want. That reminded me of a quote from the former president of the European Commission, who said, "We all know what we need to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected afterwards." Now, he solved that problem for himself by not running, but how... I was wondering when he said the quote if he had it on his mind already back then. But how do we in our democracy solve that problem? And in particular, State Secretary Stutzin, where do you see the challenges here with regard to the widening, with regard to the enlargement?
Well, maybe we can paraphrase JF Kennedy. So what can we do for the European Union? So I can maybe... first of all, what I said before, that the European Union needs to be more secure, safer, more resilient. It would be better to say the other way around. The member states needs to be able to make European Union more secure, more stable, and more resilient. So at many discussions there's this question, so what we are going to do, how we are going to tackle the issue. We are tackling the issue every day. I mean, the mechanisms of European Union are, I have to say, in a way, an amazing colossum of work that is going on every day at the institutions, at the member states. And we need to keep doing it. We need to keep going on. Now, when it came out of the COVID crisis, we may had the feeling that we did it in a way okay as the European Union, but the war in Ukraine did prove that we are too weak, especially what regards our common foreign and security policy. We have to admit we are too weak. Can we afford this weakness? That's the question. If the war ends tomorrow, relations with the Russian Federation will not be good for a decade at least. And can we afford this weakness as the European Union? And my answer to you again, how? We need to keep doing it, and we need to as a member states, do more. That's the only answer. Now, regarding the Western Balkans, and what we are advocating are concrete steps, one by one, country by country. For example, candidate status for Bosnia and Herzegovina, visa liberalization for Kosovo. So we're not talking about a new philosophy for the Western Balkans, but very concrete steps that we all know that are needed. We just need to do them. That's my answer.
Thank you very much for bringing the member states in. Mr. Rodriguez, you talked about stronger institutions, but it's the member states that also make the institutions. We have the herende verträge. What do you say can the member states or must do now as the start to make the European institutions stronger?
Well, I will answer to your question, but let me also react to what was said by the panel previously. I do think that this proposal of European political community is interesting in the sense of creating a stronger unity of Europeans in political and geopolitical terms, and this is necessary, taking into account the new global order we are driving in. But I have 3 bets about this. This should not be used to delay the enlargement process, because I fully agree with you, the enlargement process should be taken in a more quicker way and with a new approach. I am not repeating what I just said. My second bet is that this unity of Europeans in face of the global order should really be based on the full understanding what is the new global order. I think that the unity of the West is important, but this is no longer enough to ensure the future of the European project. We need to have a stronger multilateral system, which is now really being challenged, to frame this multipolar world which is in front of us and will go on being. So the West alone, if this is united, will no longer be enough to tackle this situation. So this is in our interest to renew the multilateral system. My third bet is about your question is, this should not also deter deepening, because I really believe that this time we need to make enlargement and deepening at the same time. In a coordinated, I'm not saying in precise the same time, but in a coordinated sequence, in a strategic sequence. And so my last point is about exactly how to deepen. Because I don't think we need particular clubs, as they were called for some 20 years ago. We don't need these. We need to make the European Union something more effective to decide and to act. So this depends on introducing qualified majority voting in certain areas, which are now a bit blocked. This depends on us to ensure stronger financial means. The COVID experience shows this is possible. We have created a stronger budgetary capacity to deal with a common problem. And now we have a new one, which is the energy transition and energy security is a vital interest of all Europeans. I agree with you that all this is only possible if we have citizens with us. But on this, I would have a positive word, because if we see the experience of the Conference on the Future of Europe, we saw a quite amazing situation of cities from all over Europe with a lot of common ground and calling for more important advances of the European project. But of course, we need to prepare this with citizens.
Right, thank you very much. Mr. Klose, Mr. Stutzin said we just have to do it. And you said Europe has to take the lead. Why? Where are the obstacles? Why isn't Europe perhaps taking the lead, or what needs to be done to make this leading happen?
First of all, we have made a lot of things the last year. I mean, the way we reacted to the pandemic, the way we were united with regard to Brexit, which was a very huge thing to manage, the way we remain relatively united with regard to Russia, the fact that we are understanding that solidarity is not something coming from the north and Germany to the south for Greece, Spain, and Italy or France, but that solidarity is something which can concern anybody, and this is really something really important. Solidarity with the COVID was for everybody, with the war was for initially the eastern country, and now with the energy crisis it is for Germany. The paradigm is changing, but the fact is we need to change the narrative. Europe can't be the EU can't be anymore a Franco-German project. It should be a project from everybody. And there we need to come back to the root of the European project post-war, because what we saw post-war is from Poland to Portugal, from Greece to the UK, there were people who wanted to reinvent altogether the world. And we need to base this narrative in order to include people. I think the narrative is really, really important to give a new impetus. And it's not very difficult to develop. The second thing is, Maria spoke about the conference on the future of Europe, which is based somehow on the experience there was in Ireland with the Civic Convention. And this experience is really, really important. When you sort 1,000 citizens from everywhere in Europe, from any kind of social class or origin, 95% of them don't know anything about Europe, anything. But if you ask them to behave as European, they behave as European. And they behave as informed and responsible citizens. And the fact is, if we want to go ahead, we really need to find ways to include much more massively European citizens, and we need also to develop a shared civic education, which was one issue, one recommendation of the conference. Last point, which is very important. Okay, we need deepening, but I think in terms of narrative, and somehow I agree with the minister, but I disagree with him, the question is not more or less Europe. The question is a Europe which is capable of answering the challenges. And my feeling is the last 5 years we had huge challenges, but the challenges to come are much bigger. And with the institution we have, we can't cope. So if we do not fine-tune the institution, we are going to die. And we need to explain that, because citizens want an effective Europe, but as it works, it can't be effective any longer, because the institutions are exhausting. I was speaking this morning with people from the European Commission, and they told me there are several DG who are sick or who are dying. I spoke with the ambassador to the EU in Brussels. We are dead. We can't go on with this system because it's exhausting. It requires so much energy. So we need to develop rapidly a system which can be resilient. People which are managing the European system are completely exhausted at the moment, and we have to keep that in mind. We are not ready physically for the next crisis.
Let me stay on the narrative. Charles Paul, you introduced before that we need a new narrative. The old narrative of peace, we see that it doesn't resonate with today's generation at all anymore. I think we tend to forget that at the beginning of the European integration, so at the end of the Second World War, there was another narrative that somehow got pushed away by the predominant peace narrative. And that narrative was the prosperity for the European citizens, also in view of ensuring that, let's say, certain isms of in between wars times do not repeat. So that was a narrative that was that, for example, was you can observe it in the common agricultural policy, and you can observe it also in institutions or advisory bodies such as the European Economic and Social Council. Not very important, but as I said, that narrative was pushed aside. What would be today's new narrative, or maybe in relation to what Guillaume presented?
Well, the problem here, I think, is that the real narrative is not a very sexy one. And the real narrative, to my mind, is quite simply this. The European Union is the best answer that we Europeans can ever possibly give to the question, how do we deal with globalization and its many challenges? The European Union is the best instrument that we have devised to maximize the potential benefits and minimize the potential downsides of globalization. Now, obviously, our citizens aren't going to be very enthused if we talk to them in these terms. But if you think about it, I think this is ultimately what the European Union of the 21st century is going to be. As you rightly said, the war and peace narrative doesn't mean much to younger people in particular, although, of course, Ukraine is changing that to some extent. Whether or not this is the end of abundance, again, our societies have become soft, they've become accustomed to unprecedented levels of prosperity. So it has to be, I think, something a little bit more sophisticated, but also, unfortunately, therefore, harder to explain. But can I just come back to a couple of things that have been mentioned very briefly? And it's interesting that it hasn't been mentioned yet. Treaty reform. You've been asking us, how do we deepen? Well, we had this conference on the future of Europe, which was a fantastic exercise. But what is the outcome of this conference on the future of Europe? Frankly, very disappointing. And this is partly because there is no appetite for treaty reform, for very solid, sound reasons. Now, if we can't have treaty reform, because this would probably undermine the internal cohesion of the EU at a crucial juncture, what kind of deepening is actually viable? Well, as Maria João and others were saying, possibly rather piecemeal measures, including QMV. Secondly, may I also express my surprise, the fact that Macron's ideas have gained so little traction. I think Macron is an impressive European leader, and I applaud him, and I'm very grateful to him for being so creative. But it's interesting how little success his ideas have had, probably because they're too vague, they're too self-serving, and they're too unilateralist. But ultimately, the substance of what he's saying is very important, and that is, as I said at the beginning, there seems to be a growing tension between the EU and EU-Europe as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we opened the debate much broader now, but Charles Grant, let me finish with you with a very straightforward question. How do you do EU in the center, but not an EU-centric Europe, to be appealing to Britain in the future?
Well, let me just first, I will get to that question, but first of all, there's a word nobody's mentioned today, which is NATO. NATO is a rather important organisation. It's become much more important because of the Ukraine war. I'm all for European strategic autonomy, I'm all for European defence, but the reality is that NATO and American involvement keeps Europe safe from Russia and other significant threats at the moment. There is, of course, a risk that America might pull out of NATO. Let's not forget that Donald Trump very nearly did so last time he was president. I think that's unlikely that America would leave NATO, but it's not impossible, which is why Guillaume and others are quite right to say Europe needs to do everything it can to build up its strategic autonomy as quickly as possible. But the reality is that NATO, including the Americans and the British, is going to be quite an important part of European defence for a while to come. I think what Charles is absolutely right to say that Macron would be more effective as a leader if he did some diplomacy and tried to build coalitions before launching new ideas like the European political community. He's quite effective anyway. He'd be much more effective if he learned some diplomacy. Laurence Boone talked about the EPC yesterday on her panel. I was rather, nobody else mentioned it. I think the French do have a marketing job to do and to try and persuade people to come round to this idea. When I was in Paris recently, there are two schools of thought about the EPC. One is that it should be very much dominated by the European Commission. It should be giving other countries in Europe, like those in the Western Balkans, access to parts of the single market before they can join the EU properly. The other version is a more intergovernmental talking shop. If it's the former version, the British will not be interested, I'm afraid, because if it's dominated by the European Commission and the whole EU, and it becomes EU plus, then the British will be quite small vis-à-vis the Commission and the rest of the EU, so the British will not be interested. If it's a more intergovernmental talking club, I think the British can be persuaded to take part. As several people said, it is very important that the EPC is not seen as an alternative to enlargement. Macron made the mistake in his initial outlining of the scheme and not making that point clear, and his officials admit that they made a bit of a mistake there, but I think that should improve. That's getting better now. Finally, I think how many Europes do you need? I think Macron occasionally says the Eurozone needs its own institutions, different from those of the EU. I think he's right. I think the countries in the Eurozone do need to integrate quite a lot more than those that are not in the Eurozone. In the long run, there's a certain logic to leading towards a tighter Eurozone that doesn't include all the other members that are not in the Eurozone.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me invite Mr. Alex Peterle now from the podium as the first response. I will take 30 seconds for the introduction, though I believe you know Mr. Peterle as a long-term MEP, former Prime Minister of Slovenia and Foreign Minister, and also you were the representative of, I believe then, candidate countries on the Conference on the Future of Europe. Now, while we are listening to Mr. Peterle, can I invite you to indicate to me if you have succinct questions to the panel only? And I'll keep the list.
Thank you very much. It is a privilege to be so many times former as I am. And I feel also privileged to have this special right to speak as the first listener. And thank you to the panelists for very concrete ideas, but also for the energy and optimism. Yesterday we had the chance to listen our leaders. Then we were refreshed by night owls during the night with intellectual refreshments. And I think that as far as diagnosis is concerned, we are quite okay, and we share many ideas in this regard. I was attentive to the word abundance, that abundance is over. What is not just President Macron's conviction, but there is another word which was not used, but I will use it intentionally. I think it's time, a time is approaching or is still here, which we are not accustomed to it. Now I think that we will have as a union to sacrifice many things. And when you have to sacrifice, then you have to invest in a different way than in the time of growth. And also question of solidarity gets into another context in that regard. But I'm happy that after all these discussions, I can say that I didn't hear anybody to say to speak about the better answer than Europe, and I'm happy with that. The answer is community, and no country can find solution on its own. Unity means to keep together, but we only can keep together if we really share the same values and principles and rules, I would add. And we were able to enlarge European Union in several steps successfully, but we don't have yet truly united Europe. I will not speak about Schumann's or Delors' idea about the soul, but this is another expression of the spirit of unity. You mentioned attentively my time in the European Convention. I remember how much we spoke about different speeds, about different circles and so on. I would say that different speeds are not a problem in the context of the same future, but we cannot have different directions, different orientations of the same time. I remember that, or we all know that the Lisbon Treaty allows those who wish to do more enhanced cooperation This is one possibility, but there is also so-called passerelle, which allows the decision on QMV if member states wish to do so in unanimous way. So we can do more if we wish so. Of course, there is no clear direction without vision. I would like to finish with some of questions. My first question is to the panelists. There is no, I mean, if I would comment 6 panelists, then I will lose too much time. I agree on what was said about enlargement, deepening. I was happy to hear that health is one of the priorities and so on. I was happy by so much attention to the Western Balkans, but let's go now to the question. What do you think? This is my first question. How can we produce or assure more political will? I don't think that the treaty is the main point, and I think we are not able to change the treaty very quickly. But what can we do to strengthen the political will? Then I have to ask a question on Western Balkans. There is a so-called new approach in the air. Somebody spoke about new approach as well. I think my former colleague from the European Parliament, Maria Rodriguez, mentioned new approach. We have to overcome this frustrating status of accession process in Western Balkans. And we have Ukraine, we have Moldova. We saw how NATO was quickly enlarged, but we cannot do the same with the Western Balkans as European Union. So my question is, do you have concrete ideas how to make accession process for Western Balkans more credible? Something that we have to invent something, not to overjump this offer from 2003 for full membership of Western Balkan countries, but what can we do in between to get closer, let's say. So, and then my last question. 1 year ago, we spoke here a lot about Central Europe. We spoke about gap between Western and Central Europe. My question is, do you think that we get a little bit closer in this regard? Because we can have one future and common future only if we really share the same values and principles. But I think that we are still quite different in some basic areas, let's say. So we can be strong if we share the same understanding of democracy, of dignity, of solidarity, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before returning to the panel, let me extend now the questions to the audience, or from the audience. I haven't seen any. I do see first hand up there. I'll take about 3, and I kindly ask you for a short, succinct question. If there are for specific panelists, please indicate so.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Hello. Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Blanka Jamnišek. I'm one of the ambassadors of Slovenia. I've served in Vienna to the international organizations, and I am now the R2P responsibility to protect focal point, which means this, you're probably aware of that, what R2P is. Anyway, the title, How Many Futures for European Union, should be extended for Europe. In my personal opinion, we have to reach out. I was very happy to hear about enlargement, deepening, solidarity, and everything also what Mr. Peterle said, because without reaching out, we cannot have a great future just within the EU member states. We heard yesterday from Edi Rama that we didn't even offer vaccines to Albania at the time of the crisis. So these are the real concrete questions that concern our citizens in European Union and also in Europe, because we're very connected. There's so many diaspora from those countries in our own European member states. And now the question to all panelists is, how can we, as Mr. Peterle asked, enhance the political will and use also this diaspora to enhance the process of enlargement and deepening? Because the talk show has been going on for 20 years, almost, since Thessaloniki, for the Western Balkans at least. And we're still talking and we're still, offering the vision of Europe, but the world is changing. And we have a war in Europe again, which should have been prevented in the first place. But this is very, very serious now. So where is this political will that we could enhance? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So linking the two questions of the political will and enlargement. Now, my responsibility is to protect the time management of this panel. So do I see further questions? Now, given the timing, we won't have another round. So if there are no further questions, I will return to the panel and I'll invite you to pick and choose. You have two questions. They both can be answered at length or much shorter. We have 6 minutes. I'll ask you for a minute each, and then I'll turn to you and ask you, have you changed your mind with regard to Ares, Hermes, or Athena version of the future of Europe? For those who have joined after our initial video, remind yourselves of what these three Greek gods mean in, let's say, symbolic terms. Let me go in the same order as we've been proceeding from the start. Minister Byrne.
In terms of political will, I think the Citizens' Convention in Ireland was mentioned. And the Citizens' Convention, Constitutional Convention in Ireland over the last number of years actually gave politicians political will to deal with certain issues. And also, actually, we had similar forums after the Lisbon Treaty failed the first time, where we listened to the public and politicians were able to get some guidance from the people. But Ireland recently changed its abortion law. We had the first referendum in the world on marriage equality. These would not have happened, in my opinion, without that Citizens' Convention first actually giving politicians the political will. So before the Citizens' Convention on marriage equality, I don't know if any leader in the Irish Parliament before 2015 had said that they were in favour of marriage equality. That changed almost instantly after the Citizens' Convention. Similarly, with abortion. Lisbon Treaty as well, we listened to the public at that time, and the public many times are ahead of the politicians. And that the politicians become, and I'm a politician, we become brave when we know the public is with us. So we've got to do it, in my opinion, as much genuine listening to the public as possible. Now, I welcome the Conference on the Future of Europe. I thought it was very good, but I didn't think it was perfect. And I think it actually could be improved. And perhaps on certain specific issues, we could go back to that random citizen model on it, maybe such as defence, maybe such as tax, those issues that health, I don't know whether we have to go back to the citizens, but it's one we're very interested in. And that then drives agendas in Europe and drives politicians as well, that they feel confident that that these ideas that probably they privately support have that public support. So I think that's one way. On the Western Balkans, from an Irish point of view, what we want to do is do as much as possible from the far west of the European Union to show solidarity to the region. We've got huge solidarity specifically on Brexit. You mentioned the other ones, COVID and Ukraine and all that. We've also taken the third highest number per capita of Ukrainian refugees on the far western shores of the European Union. So again, we want to show, from our point of view, not just solidarity, but genuine interest in the region. I think that's one way that we can help to drive this process forward as much as we can.
State Secretary Stutzin, ideas for concrete?
Yeah, I'll finish where Thomas ended. The question about political will, I think, is the crucial one. Mr. Peterle mentioned we'll have to sacrifice, we'll have to be solidar. And are we going to be more united out of it? Well, I'm afraid the answer is negative. But how we would concretely assure more political will? I think what Thomas also said, if the citizens would understand what European Union is already doing, then they would be more willing to sacrifice, to be united. The results of the consultations with the citizens, the conference, were that there was a huge percent of ideas that the citizens proposed were already implemented, and the citizens didn't know about it. So if we would tell them, look, we are doing this and this and this and this, I'm sure everybody, I mean, much more people would stand behind the European Union. On the Western Balkans, just maybe a short sentence. If we are pushing them away, then this is a breeding ground for nationalisms, for, I mean, of course those political elites would prosper in those, that are prospering in those conditions, so to say, are never going to do more to come closer to the European Union. So we shouldn't push them away, we should pull them in. That's my answer.
Thank you very much. This is a very long 1 minute. Let's continue in 1 minute.
My answer to Mr. Patel, a very important question. I believe that we need a stronger, on enlargement, we need stronger strategic drive. Stronger strategic drive. When it comes geopolitical coordination in foreign affairs, how to deal with Russia, example. When it comes the political dimension, including governance and rule of law, but also when it comes dealing with economic and social issues, because this is much more than just preparing the access to a single market. This is about integrating these countries in all our European networks, in products, in services, in the digital, in energy transition, in education, in research, in culture, and also in health. I think this is unacceptable in a situation of pandemics, that these countries are not given exactly the same conditions we have inside the European Union. So this is my vision about how to deal with enlargement, to take it seriously and to make it visible to citizens in these countries. My last point about treaty changes. This is the taboo question, but I'm at ease on this because I'm very proud that I was part of the team making the final negotiation of the Lisbon Treaty. I'm living in Lisbon, also in Brussels. We rescued the Constitutional Treaty somehow. We can do a lot of things with the Lisbon Treaty, a lot. There is a lot of potential, but there are also some limits. And that's why I consider that we need some target updates of the treaty to enable the European Union on strategic autonomy, capacity to decide, energy, foreign affairs, to move with the energy transition. And I'm afraid that the mechanisms we have foreseen, the passerelle and enhanced cooperation, which are there, are not effective enough. So, but I know this is for a second panel, not for now.
Indeed, for a second panel. Jon Klosser, on political will, I imagine, 60 seconds.
Political will, I fully agree with Thomas. And I think Ireland should make a proposal in order to, from the conference on the future of Europe, build something more effective and do it very quickly, because we need to empower political leaders. And this is key. And in addition to that, I think it's time to have a vision for 2049. We need to make a prospective exercise, because now we understand well the dynamic, which was not the case 1 or 2 years ago. And second, regarding European political community, the cost to have a country which do not share the same level of infrastructure is too high now. So we really need to have an investment plan to put everybody very rapidly at the same level. I repeat myself, the cost of a weak neighborhood around Europe is too high. Is too high. So we need to invest rapidly and massively. And this will be an answer to the enlargement.
Thank you very much. Charles Powell.
Very quickly, 2 points. First of all, as has already been said, we need to do more to help accession countries converge more quickly. Let's not forget, in 1994, we invented the European Economic Area to facilitate, to help EFTA countries come closer to our European economies. Admittedly, the EFTA countries were more developed than the Western Balkans, say, but this is a kind of model that we might keep in mind. Why not allow candidate countries to benefit from some of the 4 freedoms? By the way, we've already done this with Ukraine, as far as free movement of people is concerned. So we can be quite creative. And secondly, finally, last year you were worried about north-south, east-west tensions within the EU. Well, if there's one thing that we can thank Mr. Putin for, is that he is the greatest external federator that we have had in decades.
Thank you. Last word from the panel goes
Well,
to Charles.
on Charles's last point, I'm a little bit less optimistic. Yes, the EU has been united in response to the Ukraine war, but as the former minister said, Mr. Pasolet, there are divisions. There are two schools of thought in the EU about how to handle Ukraine. There's the Baltic, Nordic, Polish school, which is isolate Russia, be incredibly tough, don't let their citizens into our countries. And there's the French, German, Italian school, which is to say, well, let's think that in the long run we're going to have a relationship with Russia, so let's not cut all our ties with them. Now, those two schools of thought are working together at the moment quite constructively. There hasn't been a great bust-up, but I do worry about that. And just very finally, on the Western Balkans, Charles is absolutely right. There's thinking in Paris and other places and in Brussels about allowing candidate countries to get some of the benefits of membership before they join. I think that's an excellent idea. That's not to be confused with the European political community. They should be kept apart, those two things. And on the political will point, I mean, we need better politicians leading our countries. We need more Macrons and more Mario Draghis, more people who think about the EU. You can't persuade citizens to follow paths towards greater integration without persuasive speakers, persuasive talkers who understand some of the issues. Most of the European leaders do not at all. Thank goodness there are people like Macron and Draghi who do. We need more of them.
Thank you very much. That concludes the panel, but not before I ask you for the temperature in the room. So at the beginning of the panel, I asked you whether you believe that the likely future, the scenario for the future of Europe in 2050 is the Ares one, as presented in the video at the beginning, or the Hermes one, or the Athena. So at the beginning, we had one hand up for Ares, which you can imagine was quite a bleak, dark 2050 in Europe. There were 12 hands up for Hermes, an economic integration, but without much political integration. And then Athena was, well, overwhelming majority. Let me check this now. A bleak, dark version for Europe in 2050. Ares, hands up. None. Congratulations. Hermes. We won't go into detail on that. Hermes. No, he didn't leave. Your hand is up now for Hermes. He didn't leave. That's about this. Now it's less. So I won't leave it to math, but let me see. Hands up for Athena. Yeah, it's not that overwhelming, I think, but thank you very much. I think it has been a persuasive panel. We did not enter technical discussions, but this is for the next time. I think we did open some things out of the box. I will not try to summarize, but maybe put forward just 3 things that I thought were coming in centrally. Widening and deepening are not either or, and they need to be done in parallel. If you look at the 23-24 June conclusions of the European Council, I'm not so sure they think it like that, but this panel certainly thought it like that. In deepening and widening, I think we agreed that we need 2 things at the same time. We need a process and we need results. There has to be results at the same time. And thirdly, we must not forget the European citizens in that story, the European or the EU citizens, and of course, the European values. And on that, and 5 minutes late than we were supposed to be, I would like to thank my wonderful panel. I'd like to ask you to join me in my thank note also to Mr. Petele. And I wish you a good continuation of the Bled Strategic Forum. Thank you.
ladies. Ladies and gentlemen, if I can have your attention, please. Thank you so much. Please take your seats so that we can get started. For everyone, my name is Ali Hassan. I'm a Berlin-based international TV presenter and journalist. And for everyone who was here yesterday, I think you would concur and agree with me that the BSF 2022 got off to a very powerful, very emotional, very strong start. And I'm delighted to say that the second day is equally starting on a very strong note. We're extremely delighted to be joined now by somebody who has shaped European and global politics for a decade and continues to do so in other capacity these days. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the former Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the Executive Chairman of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, Tony Blair. It's great to have you with us here.
Thank you very much, Ali.
At the Bled Strategic Forum. Just to be very clear and transparent, because Tony Blair got knighted recently, so my first question to him backstage was, how do I address you? I say, is it Sir Tony? And he just said, call me Tony. So, so this is not a lack of respect, quite on the contrary. Delighted to have you with us, Tony, here on stage, talking about the very imminent and current challenges of our time. And we have to start, of course, no surprise, with Ukraine. It dominated the first day of the Bled Strategic Forum. It will certainly dominate the second one and many more to come, I'm afraid. When you were Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin came into power in 2000. And back then, I looked up some quotes of yours and some Western leaders. You were actually quite upbeat and optimistic that here is a Russian leader who gets the West, who is going to be a partner for the West and to the West. What went wrong?
Quite a lot. But before I do that, let me say how delighted I am to be at the forum. And yeah, by all means, you can call me Tony. If any of you want to see something truly amusing, you can look on the internet and find the picture of me when I got my knighthood, because this is a special knighthood. It's given by the Queen. It's been since 1340 in the UK. And by tradition, when you get the knighthood, you have to dress in the same outfit that they had in 1340. There's nothing quite so absurd as looking at yourself in a picture of 14th century costume. So if you want a good laugh, go and see that.
You know, everybody's Googling it right now.
That's what you can do nowadays. So, no, when I first met Vladimir Putin, at his insistence, we met in St. Petersburg, the western-facing part of Russia. He was talking about the modernization of the Russian economy. He wanted a strong relationship with the West. I think I was the first European leader actually to go and see him. And, you know, I always say that was the first incarnation of President Putin that I knew. Then, as the years went on, it became increasingly clear that he turned away from economic reform and instead towards a form of nationalism. But that nationalism meant that he really destroyed the democracy within his own country. It's true he had certain foreign adventures, Georgia, Crimea, but in that second incarnation where I knew him, it was within fairly defined limits. And my anxiety, frankly, is that there is a third incarnation, which is brutal and based on a fantasy, because what has happened in Ukraine is not just unacceptable, but it's impossible ever for him to achieve what he wants to achieve. And I thought one of the great things about the conference yesterday, and it came through very strongly, obviously, in what Ursula von der Leyen said, is you know, this act of aggression is shocking, but it has brought Europe together, and Europe will stick together. And by the way, for these purposes, I include Britain as part of Europe. Okay? So we will stick together, and that aggression will not succeed. And I think he has grossly underestimated not just the determination of the Ukrainian people, but the determination of Europe.
That aggression will not succeed. You say, I asked the very same thing to President Zelensky yesterday, who was as defiant as ever, and he says, we will prevail, we will win in the end. But realistically speaking, what would a win look like for Ukraine?
Well, how this thing ends, I mean, I've from the very beginning said that we should have a dual strategy. The first should be to give Ukraine everything they need in terms of finance and weapons in order that they can defend themselves. The second is to do that in order to create eventually the scope for a negotiated settlement of the conflict. But it's got to be one that is not just in line with the aspirations and hopes of the Ukrainian people for the future, but one that does not reward Russian aggression. Now, what that in the end looks like is obviously going to be a matter for debate, but I can't see any basis for a negotiated end to this that in any shape or form rewards Russia or gives Russia anything for what it has done.
The President Putin is also, doesn't strike me, perhaps you as a politician who will go away quietly and concede defeat.
No, that is true. And over the years, as he's shown in Syria, he's got huge staying power. But on the other hand, this has been a massive miscalculation. The original plan, for sure, was to topple the government and install a puppet government. That's failed. The ambition now, I think, is to keep as much of the south and west of Ukraine. But, you know, as we can see from the offensive that's been launched now, even that is in doubt. There are huge logistical problems. I don't think, you know, it's interesting this. Of course, as a result of the conflict, this is causing huge pressure in our own countries. I mean, in Britain, the cost of living crisis is, you know, there isn't another political issue. I think it's the same virtually everywhere in Europe, but nowhere do I see, not in our country, for example, do people say, well, you know, we should just give Russia what they want in Ukraine in order to give ourselves some cost of living space. No, people are not saying that. So I think he's going to find it increasingly hard. I think the sanctions that are biting hardest are the ones people don't really see, which are the sanctions on the supply of components, the things the Russian economy needs. And, you know, there are, according to some estimates, you know, a couple of million people that have left Russia since the beginning of the conflict. And you know what those people will be. They'll be the younger, more connected people who will just see no future for themselves in the Russia that is today. And, you know, democracy has got a bit of a, well, it's been challenged, let's say, in recent years. But, you know, there are two decisions that I think are very interesting, that are decisions that show you why democracy is, in the end, for all its faults, the best way of governing. One is the decision to invade Ukraine, because in a democratic system that would never have happened. It's why no two democracies have ever been to war with each other. People would have said, no, this is crazy, you shouldn't do this, don't do it, here are all the reasons. But if you have a system that's dictatorial with no challenge, then people can do these things. And the other is, frankly, the COVID policy of China. You know, both are decisions that would never have been taken had you had a system that challenged the leadership. Right? So, you know, this is what has happened. I think, look, I hope it can be brought to an end peacefully, but in the meantime, we've got to give Ukraine every support.
Much has been made yesterday about the war in Ukraine being a wake-up call for Europe and the West. And I know you've been quite critical. You've been saying many times that the West is at an inflection point, that Western democracy needs a new project. Western politics has turned partisan, ugly, unproductive. This is what you said in your recent speeches. Are you hopeful that this war is going to be the glue, is going to be the accelerator for Western Europe to come together and regain its sense of purpose?
I mean, I'm naturally optimistic. Okay, so you can't be British Prime Minister with our media and not be naturally optimistic. So I think yes, but I think we should define what this inflection point is. I mean, I think there were two other inflection points in recent European history and Western history. One was in 1945, when after the Second World War, there was a project of creating NATO as a bulwark against the communist Soviet Union. That project, which was around foreign policy and defense, was matched then by a domestic policy. You know, most countries around the world, from the Western perspective, right, developed welfare states, healthcare systems, education systems. You know, in the UK, it wasn't just about the creation of NATO and the creation of defense and security relationships. It was also a domestic, a policy about our economy and our society as well. And then in the 1980s, I think, again, there was a project that was around how we brought the Soviet Union to the point of collapse, but also there was then a project of liberalization, if you like, within European and Western economies. I think today it's very clear what our foreign policy objective is, because the significance of Ukraine is not just in respect of Russia, it's in respect of China also. Because the biggest geopolitical change of my children's lifetime is going to be China and what it means for 21st century politics. Now, we can get on to that in a minute. But that is what that should do, the combination of what's happened in Ukraine and the thought of the power of China for the future, is the West should recover its cohesion strategically in terms of foreign policy and its confidence in its own value system. But we also need a domestic agenda as well, because I don't know how things look here, but I would say in most of the major Western countries right now, politics is often deeply divided. There's a huge crisis. You know, the cost of living crisis is going to go on for some time. You're going to have inflation, rising interest rates. You know, we've got a tough situation ahead of us with politics becoming very partisan. So you also need a domestic policy agenda. What is our project for domestic policy? And my view, and this is something we can debate, is the single biggest real world event that's happening is the technology revolution. It's going to change everything. It is changing everything. But the problem that you've got today is that the people in government making policy, they're in one room and the change makers are in another room. And you've got to make the policy makers and the change makers come together, because this technology revolution, in my view, is the only way you're going to recover growth, productivity, higher living standards, and you're going to deal with climate change. There isn't another way of doing it. Now, I may be wrong on that, but it's a debate we should have. My point is, the inflection point is got to be more than just about defense and security. I think that is obvious. I think what's less obvious is if you were back in politics today governing a country, what would you be trying to do in terms of domestic policy? Because otherwise you're facing a situation where your society is going to become more divided between the wealthier people and the poorer people, and growth and productivity are going to be down where they need to be up.
And that's quite a challenge, isn't it? If we're looking at the landscape, even looking at Italy these days, where Ms. Giorgia Meloni might take over soon, we're seeing politicians also fueled by social media who are offering easy solutions to very complex problems, getting increasingly more complex. That certainly wasn't different when you were in charge, but social media didn't play that big of a role back then, did it? At the end of the day, if you're looking at the landscape, political landscape right now as to compared to when you were in charge, what is the biggest difference?
Well, social media for sure. Look, when I was in office, I didn't even have a mobile phone.
Was that good or bad?
It was good. It was good. Hello. It led to, I got my first mobile phone the day after I left office. And I remember, it's fantastic, right? So I sent my first text to somebody, and I didn't realize that it didn't necessarily show up who I was for the person receiving it. So I got a message back that said, "Sorry, but who are you?" And I was thinking, it's been 24 hours, you know. So, you know, social media is a revolutionary phenomenon because it's about the first lesson you learn in leadership, in politics, is that those that shout loudest don't deserve to be heard most. Right. But social media is a platform for the loudmouth. You know, I sometimes read this stuff and I think, first of all, who is it that's got the time to sit there and do all this, right? But secondly, it's just the casual abuse, the exchange of usually ill-informed opinions masquerading as political debate. And so it's very difficult. But I think there is an irony, a paradox in social media. It creates waves of opinion that put real pressure on politicians, right? On the other hand, the curious thing is, at the same time, the public respects leadership. So for me, I'm always looking for the politicians that say, I don't care what's on social media, here's what I think, and this is what I'm going to do. Because I respect that, right? And I think probably a lot of the public does as well. But for the politicians, it's very hard. You know, you get some avalanche going on in social media. And I always say to political leaders, okay, but you've got to decide whether this represents 10,000 people, 100,000 people, 1 million people, or maybe just one person. You know, so yeah, that's a big change. But the other big change is this, and this comes back to this point about a modern agenda. You see, we live in an era where people need radical change. I mean, take your healthcare system, right? In most countries, it's underperforming, right? Your education system is underperforming. You've got a category of people that aren't participating in the wealth of society. If you don't have a rational answer to that problem, then the populace comes along and says, no, it's easy. The right say it's the immigrants. The left says, no, it's the big business, right? And that populism then destroys what I call a strong center. And the truth of the matter is, today's world is about understanding this change that's going on and looking at how you harness it. So healthcare today is going to be all about how you move to a different system of diagnostics, how people look after their own healthcare in a much greater way, how you empower patients, how you reorganize your healthcare system, difference between the tertiary, secondary, primary care. It's all about that. It's all about how you deliver new treatments. You know, you look at COVID and the development of mRNA vaccines, right? That is a medical revolution. It's also, by the way, going to spin out a whole lot of other advances in medical science. But how you deliver this and how you make it impact the organization of your healthcare system, that is the issue. But how many people are really debating that issue in the way that it needs? Likewise with education. You know, how you teach young people today and the skills they need, it's just completely different. I mean, I think in education today, you'll basically have two sets of skills that will be really important. It was explained to me the other day by someone who works in the school system in the UK. He said, basically, you're going to have hard tech skills, and then you're going to have hard human skills, right? And it's going to be a combination of understanding, because your teacher's not going to give you all the information anymore. You know, when I think of the education I had, I mean, okay, I can probably still recite the kings and queens of England going back 7 centuries, but frankly, I've never found that a huge amount of use. Right. So today, what do employers look for? They look for people familiar with technology, because that's what's happening in their businesses, but they also look for young people with creative skills, right, who can solve problems collaboratively, who've got some ability to think of things differently, right? Those are skills that we're in danger of underestimating completely within the education system. So my point is this: if you want to take on this populism, you can't just say to people, look, you've got the crazy left and the crazy right, and we just should be sensible. You need a bigger project than that. That's why I come back to this thing. You need to decide what 21st century politics looks like. And that is, I think that's the toughest task, because on the foreign policy side, I think it's pretty obvious where we are. But I find the domestic side much more challenging.
And it's quite challenging indeed. You've mentioned many of those challenges: healthcare, cost of living, rising inflation, the pandemic. Could go on and on, energy, food security. And people are looking for leadership. People are looking for political leadership all over the world. And as somebody who was in charge for 10 years of a large country, one person alone cannot fix all these problems, can they? At the end of the day, people look for political leadership. But is the political class, I guess is what I'm asking, up to these enormous challenges? Or is this unfair for us as the populace to ask for one or two persons to actually fix all these problems at the same time, when they all have global ramifications and links, of course?
Well, politics is a strange business, you know. I mean, I always think the journey of being a leader is that you start in government at your most popular and least capable, and then you end at your least popular and most capable. And you kind of, by the time you come to the end, you kind of want to say to people, look, I've worked out how to do this stuff now. You don't want to get rid of me. I know how to do it. But, you know, politics is, I mean, you imagine if you were running a football club and, you know, I don't know, Man City, Man United.
Big change.
Right, in my case, Newcastle. But anyway, but imagine if you said, right, we've got to hire a new coach. But I tell you what we're going to do. We're just going to go out, and whoever is the most enthusiastic fan, we're going to put them in charge. People say, you're mad. You've got to have someone with qualifications who's done a whole lot of work and has worked their way up and knows the system. In politics, no. I mean, the first job I had was Prime Minister. You know, if you're going to start at the top, it's a good thing to do, but...
How did that work out?
Well, it was tough at the... You know, I said to my people after about 18 months, I said, look, I've got to level with the British people. I've got to go out there and say, you know, you just got to understand, I'm still learning. I'm learning on the job here. And they said, no, you can't. The people will panic because everyone expects you to come in fully formed, and you're not. So what is necessary for political leaders is I think three things. First of all, you've got to have a plan, you know, because one of the weaknesses of Western policymaking at the moment is the absence of long-term thinking and strategy. And one of the things you really learn as a leader is the difference between the day-to-day and the crises and the events you have to deal with and long-term strategy, right? What I used to call the big picture. So you need that. Secondly, you need other people around you. But it's easier to draw those other people around you if you've all got a common project, right? And you find then people of ability gravitate towards you. But the third thing you need is you need time. I mean, in the work my institute does, and we basically help governments make change. We have teams of people go and live and work in a country and work with the government of a country to help them make change. I reckon you need 15 to 20 years of consistent policy to bring about change. Now, that doesn't mean to say you have the same leader for 15 to 20 years, but the same project. And part of the trouble is, you know, at the moment our politics is kind of lurching from one side to another, and, you know, you only have to look at the US. I mean, if you're an external partner of the United States at the moment, you know, you look back over the last 20 years, you're finding consistency of policy quite hard to divine from the external point of view. So I think this is all difficult, but the one thing you know, this is definitely true of leadership in any situation, whether you're leading a country, you know, a corporation or a football club indeed. You know, you need to give people a clear sense of direction, and that's why I come back to this question of strategy. What is our foreign policy objective in the West? And what is our domestic policy objective? Because for the first time in modern history, there is going to be a challenge to Western dominance from the East that is, at one level, a legitimate challenge, because China and, of course, India, by dint of population, size of economy, technology, civilization, culture. These are going to be major powers in the world. But the challenge is, particularly in respect of China, they've got a different ideology to ours. And so we're going to face a big challenge, and that's why the unity of the West and the recovery of strength in the West is so important.
Of course, I cannot pass up the opportunity to speak to you about UK-EU relationships post-Brexit. As a matter of fact, I was on stage at the Bled Strategic Forum with EU Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier 4 years ago, where he prematurely announced that a Brexit deal was imminent. Of course, we know it came a bit different. It took a little while longer. Of course, it's one of the most prominent, outspoken critics and opponents of Brexit now in 2022. How do you assess the situation? First of all, how did Brexit work out for those who were advocating for it? Do you see some buyer's remorse?
Right, well, I think I've got another appointment now, so... okay, let me try and choose my words carefully.
You're not running for office, so...
No, but, you know, old habits die hard. Look, I was deeply opposed to Brexit, as you rightly say. I mean, right now the challenge is to try and fix the problems, both economically and politically. There's no appetite in the UK for returning to the essential Brexit debate, so we're going to have to, make the best of the situation we're in. Now, I think that there is a way we can reassess and refashion a relationship with Europe outside of the European Union, where we're looking at the areas of cooperation, defense and security, energy, maybe technology, maybe there are other areas of cooperation. We're going to have to fix the trading relationship, outside of the single market and customs union, but we're going to have to work out how we deal with the problems. And of course, the Northern Ireland Protocol, we're going to have to fix that. And I hope that when the new Prime Minister is appointed, she or he will fix that. But, as I always say to people in the UK, we can change our political relationship with Europe. We can change our legal relationship with Europe, but we can't change our geography. We're part of the continent of Europe. We will always be a European nation, right? And, I think particularly for the younger generation in the UK, they want to see us with a revitalized relationship with Europe, even if we're outside, but to be working together and to be thinking of ourselves as allies and partners, because we are. And it's particularly important. I mean, Ukraine brings this home to us. Okay, whatever the disagreements between Britain and people inside the European Union, on this one, we're together. And it's important we're together. When we talk about fashioning a strategy towards China for the future, we should be together. So, yeah. Anyway, that's what I hope.
Yeah.
But it's difficult because this, the tragedy for British politics, but I think you can see this echoed or replicated in much of politics around the Western world. And I'm going to put it in very brutal terms here. How did we in Britain ever come to the point where the two of the most influential people in British politics were Nigel Farage and Jeremy Corbyn? I mean, how did we ever come to that point? I mean, if you'd said to me when I was Prime Minister, oh, those are the two guys who are going to decide the future, I would have suggested you went for therapy. And now it's us who's having to go for therapy because they did. And, the damage that was done to the Labour Party, for example, by this, which is now fortunately recovering under the new leadership, and then the Conservative Party becoming what it really was. The Conservative Party was always the sensible party, supposedly. That was their thing. And then they got a dose of nationalism. And the trouble with this nationalism is that it's the easiest tune in the world to play, but it's the most superficial. Because in the world of which it's developing, you're not representing your country's interests by becoming part of this narrow nationalism. You say you are, but it's a false sort of patriotism. Because in the end, your national interest lies in cooperating with others. Because look, you take climate change, there's no way you can deal with that unless you're working together with other people. So this is, look, I think we will resolve it in time. But I think right now, for the UK, as I say, I don't think there's any desire to revisit the whole decision, but I do think sensible people recognize you've got to have a decent relationship with your own continent.
But clearly, judging by your words, you're quite concerned about not just the future of the continent, but your country. Clearly, the words that you spoke about the state of British politics are very significant. You are, after all, the only Labour leader in the party's 100-year history to win 3 consecutive elections. And as you pointed out, there's a new leadership race right now in the UK after the tumultuous Boris Johnson years. I don't want to put you in a delicate spot of having to comment on the leadership race, but Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer.
Well, look, so far as the Conservative Party is concerned, I don't know anything more than's in the papers. They say that Liz Truss is going to win, so the likelihood is that she's the Prime Minister, so they say, but I have no idea.
She's going to make a good Prime Minister?
Well, I hope she makes a good Prime Minister, because I want anyone who occupies that position to do well for Britain. But, you know, Keir Starmer, I think, has made, that I do know about, has made big changes in the Labour Party. I think he's a very capable, sensible guy. So at least we're going to be competitive as the Labour Party today, and that's a big change and an important one. But I still think, you know, for the country as a whole, it's, you know, look, Britain has enormous strengths. It's got its, you know, big strengths in the financial sector and technology sector. Actually, Britain potentially is very strong in life sciences, for example. You know, we've got a deep set of relationships around the world. We've got a culture and a language that's a great set of attributes for us, a very strong university sector. We've got lots of strengths, and I'm, you know, at one level, I'm, you know, always confident that Britain will see its way through, but I think we're just at this very, you know, as we described earlier, at this inflection moment where it really does require political leaders to have such a clear idea of what they stand for and what they want to achieve.
You talked about the fringes dominating European politics these days, global politics, really. You were, of course, synonymous with the term and concept of a third way. Do you think I'm hearing that a new third way would be desirable, is needed, and in that context, of course, I'm listening to you now, and you're as energetic and passionate and enthusiastic about politics as I remember back then. Political comeback with a new party, perhaps?
No, let's not get into that one. That would be to give the Bled Forum a position in the UK media that would probably be good for it and not so good for me. No, but I do think, you see, I think it's important to realise what myself, at the time, Bill Clinton, and other people were trying to do. I think we were trying to make sense of what I would say should have been the end of 20th century politics. Where 20th century politics was really a battle between the state and the market, where the left used to think the more power you give the state, the more just the society. Right. As you guys here in Slovenia know, I'm afraid that's not true. Right? You know, the state can become its own vested interest and can be just as oppressive and brutal as any form of market domination. And then on the other side, the idea of the market being, you know, the invisible hand of the market being this hand of perfection, you know, delivering the outcomes everyone wanted. People understand that's wrong. So what you come to in the end is a question not about whether you should have a state with power, but how is that power used? And in particular, is it used to give power to itself or to empower people? And that's the purpose of having the state with an education system, a healthcare system, looking after law and order and so on, to make sure that the welfare of the people is better off. And in terms of the market, obviously, and particularly today with the fast change in the corporate sector, you need an enterprising private sector, right? Now, those two things are obvious today. And the parameters of where you put the intersection between state and market, I think you can debate that, but I don't think it's particularly interesting. It's much more interesting to me to say, well, how do you stimulate that enterprising private sector? And what is it that the state should do, and how does it do it well? Those are the big questions. And so what we were trying to do with the third way is to say, get out of traditional socialism versus traditional capitalism debates, because it's really not how the next century is going to work. And I think that's still true. And the tragedy is that parts of Western politics have gone back, with the left thinking what's radical is how much power does the state, does it go back to nationalization and more power to the state? And the right thinking, it's nationalism, anti-immigration. If you look at successful societies around the world today, a lot of them have been built on the success of the migrant population. I mean, to be anti-immigrant is just, of course you need control and rules, but immigrants in a country like Britain have contributed an enormous amount. You look at Silicon Valley and tell me how many of the major firms there weren't started by people who were migrants. So I think the third way was an attempt to make sense of 20th century politics, but most of all, it was an attempt to put reason at the forefront, analyze the way the world is changing, and then see how you apply those values to a changing world. And the problem is really trying to go recapture the spirit of that is important. Going back to the policies we had in 1997 or, whatever in America, no, of course, it's a completely different world. But the spirit of that, looking for rational solutions, trying to work out what the future looks like and how you prepare for it, I think that's still, well, it's better than the two alternatives. Put it like that.
So we're clearly not making any headlines here, BSF headlines about a political comeback. But one thing is for sure. I mean, you're still, and we're slowly. I'm being mindful of the time that we're coming to the end. You're still shaping policy through your Institute for Global Change. And I was wondering, after 10 years of being British Prime Minister and now 15 years of experience working with governments around the world, what is the most important lesson that you have learned and that you could pass on to future generations? Many of them are here in the audience today.
Well, I mean, I've learned a lot of humility over that time. And I'm still astounded by the amount that I don't know. But I've learned a lot since leaving office. In fact, sometimes I'm shocked by how much I've learned since leaving office and think it would have been useful to have known all that when I was there. But the two things I've learned are these. One is that the quality of governance is the determining factor of success in today's world. Because everything else is mobile. Capital's mobile, technology's mobile. What isn't mobile is your government. And if you look at the European Union, one of the reasons why I'm so passionately in favor of the European Union, when you look at governments that have made big changes in their country, you can point to individual examples. You might point to Singapore, or you might point to Israel, you might point to in Africa, Rwanda. But if you look at the biggest changes that have happened in governments, a lot of it has been those countries for enlargement, that come into the European Union and change their countries dramatically. Europe has had a huge, dramatic impact on the progress of countries. Now, why is that? Because the European Union provided certain standards and governments had to change to adapt to that. So reform, you can take two countries around the world today who are side by side, same resources, same potential. One succeeds, one fails. I've just given you one, Rwanda. You compare with the next door, Burundi. Or you could look at Poland, part of the European Union, and before the conflict, but look at Ukraine. Look at where they were in 1992, roughly equivalent. Look at where they were in 2021, right? Or you could look at Colombia and Venezuela, right? Or the biggest experiment in governance that the world has ever known, which is the Korean Peninsula, North and South Korea. In the 1960s, South Korea had a GDP per head the same as Sierra Leone, right? And look at it today. Now, how's that come about? Through change, through reform, through the rule of law, through democratic accountability, right? So that's one big lesson I've learned, the absolute central importance of governance, and it's why all the things we've been talking about are so important. But the second thing is about the technology revolution. Now, you know, it's hard for someone from an older generation to understand this. I was saying when I had dinner with the president here last night, and I was talking to him about technology, and I described to him how just recently I was asked to go and address a conference on cryptocurrency and its implications for geopolitics. So I'm about 2 hours from going on to the conference, and I'm struggling. I'm struggling with some of the cryptocurrency and what it means and so on. So I phone up my son, who's got a technology company, he's big in the technology sector, and I say to him, look, I'm about to go on the stage in 2 hours' time, talking about cryptocurrency. I said, what do I say? He said, Dad, tell him you're sick. Tell him you just, he said, tell him you just failed your COVID test. He said, tell him anything, but you're not fit to go on that stage. I'm just telling you right now, right? So it's difficult for someone from an old generation, but I'm just looking at the world objectively and saying it's all about that. And increasingly what it'll be is how the first bit connects with the second bit. So that's what I'm learning. And if there's any advantage in being outside of government rather than inside, is that occasionally you can see the big picture clearer than those people dealing with the day-to-day.
You were Prime Minister for 10 years. You won 3 consecutive elections. Do you miss power? Do you miss being in power?
Well, do you want the honest answer or the not honest answer?
Absolutely.
The not honest answer is, no, I'm really enjoying life. It's great, you know.
Some do.
Yeah.
On that note, it was a treat. It was a treat listening to you, Tony, Prime Minister, Sir Tony. So listening to you, getting a broad perspective of 21st century politics, what needs to be done with the wisdom of somebody who's been there and now has the luxury or the burden to remain on the sidelines. Nonetheless, I think BSF Day 2 is off to a very strong start, thanks to you, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Executive Chairman of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, Tony Blair. Thank you so much.